Hello, everyone. If you've been following the news, you've been seeing that tensions between the United States and Venezuela in South America have become very tense, as the United States is accusing the Venezuelan government of being the mastermind of trafficking drugs to the United States, and that the United States is publicly trying to seek regime change to topple the government of Venezuela and its president, Nicolas Maduro. And this is not the first time that the United States has tried to topple Nicolas Maduro and the socialist regime in Venezuela. What if I told you that the United States and Venezuela didn't always used to be enemies of each other? For those who can remember a time before the year 2000, it used to be very different. The United States and Venezuela used to be very close allies and friends with each other. And Venezuela was one of the biggest suppliers of oil to the United States. How did US-Venezuelan relations get this bad? What was the turning point where these two friends started becoming foes of each other? That's what this video is going to go through, diving through the timeline of how the United States and Venezuela ended up getting to this point that the U.S. is seeking possibly to even invade Venezuela. So where does this story between the United States and Venezuela really begin? The United States had relations with Venezuela since the 1800s, but started paying more attention to Venezuela when oil was first discovered in Venezuela in 1914. And that is when Venezuela starts attracting more interest because everyone wants oil. And American oil companies begin showing interest and wanting to do business in Venezuela. During the early to mid 20th century, Venezuela, like many South American countries, was ruled by military dictators, such as General Juan Vicente Gomez and later General Marcos Pérez Jiménez in the 1950s. And the United States worked and supported these military dictators who were repressive towards the people of Venezuela in order to get access to the oil. In the late 1950s, Venezuela ended up transitioning to being a democracy, which was rare in South America. And from 1959 onwards, Venezuela was a civilian-run government with elections and a democracy in a continent full of repressive military dictatorships. And in 1960, Venezuela ended up becoming one of the founding members of OPEC. And the United States continued relying on buying Venezuelan oil and being one of their biggest customers. The moment where American-Venezuelan relations started to go bad was when Hugo Chavez became president of Venezuela in 1999. Hugo Chavez, also known as Hugo Chavez, was a very radical socialist and was previously a military officer in the Venezuelan military and even tried leading a military revolt and takeover attempt in 1992 to try to take over the government, which failed. And Chavez was actually arrested, but later pardoned and let out of jail. And then he tried running for president of Venezuela in 1998 under a very radical socialist platform and won. After Chavez became president of Venezuela in 1999, he started to try to launch a socialist revolution in Venezuela. When Hugo Chavez became president of Venezuela in 1999, one of the first things he did that caught the attention of the U.S. government and had them raise their eyebrows was starting a close relationship with communist Cuba. Because the United States had been trying to undermine communist Cuba and isolate them and try to have their government overthrown since the 1960s, the United States did not like seeing Latin American countries going back to restarting relations with Cuba from the 1990s onwards. And in the case of Hugo Chavez, he had always been an admirer of Fidel Castro, the leader of the Cuban Revolution and longtime dictator of Cuba, even before Chavez became president. And so, when Hugo Chavez became president, he started sending Venezuelan oil and energy to Cuba, which was a huge lifeline to Cuba after decades of a tough U.S. embargo against the island. The beginning of Venezuelan-U.S. relations taking a hit is when George W. Bush becomes president in 2001, and after the September 11th attacks, launches the war on terrorism and starts with an invasion of Afghanistan to go after Osama bin Laden and his terrorist group, the Al-Qaeda, and their training camps in Afghanistan. And Hugo Chavez begins publicly criticizing the American bombing of Afghanistan by showing pictures of dead Afghan children who were being killed by the U.S. bombing, and says that the U.S.'s way of doing the war on terrorism is harmful in the wrong way. And this is where the United States government starts viewing Hugo Chavez as a foe, and from then on, Hugo Chavez starts becoming more and more of a vocal critic of American foreign policy, especially George W. Bush and his war on terrorism. In April 2002, Hugo Chavez was briefly overthrown from power by members of the Venezuelan military for 2 days. Hugo Chavez's supporters loudly protested his overthrow and demanded that he be restored to office. And the military caved in and restored him to office. And the United States did not criticize the coup. And from then on, Hugo Chavez begins accusing the United States of having played a role in his brief overthrow. And there is now more mistrust between the United States and Venezuela. And Hugo Chavez then starts becoming more loudly critical of the United States, including after the United States invaded Iraq in 2003, and when the United States did an invasion and regime change in Haiti in 2004, and America's drone strikes throughout the Bush administration. Also, Hugo Chavez criticizes America's role in neighboring Colombia, where the United States launched an intervention plan in 1999 called Plan Colombia to try to help the Colombian government crush the communist guerrilla groups who have been waging war in Colombia since the 1960s. Hugo Chavez was a vocal supporter of some of the leaders of communist guerrilla groups such as the FARC, or the FARC, and the ELN, and allegedly gave safe haven to some of these guerrilla groups to sometimes have camps in Venezuela. The United States government and the Colombian government during the 2000s, President Alvaro Uribe of Colombia and American President George W. Bush accuse Hugo Chavez of helping these communist guerrilla groups from Colombia. Other diplomatic moves that Hugo Chavez made were forming closer relations with some of America's adversaries, such as Russia, China, Iran, and of course Cuba. And his election ended up inspiring other politicians similar to him to be elected in other South American countries in what was called the Pink Tide, where left-wing and even socialist leaders ended up being elected to office, such as Evo Morales in Bolivia, Rafael Correa in Ecuador, and Nestor Kirchner in Argentina. And these leaders also ended up forming closer relations with China and with Russia and other American adversaries. And the United States started losing more and more of its power and influence over South America. And these countries started wanting to decouple themselves from the United States and diversify their options, something that the Bush administration feared and viewed with horror. In 2013, Hugo Chavez died at the age of 58 after 14 years in power, and as he was dying, did a very autocratic, dictatorial move of selecting a hand-picked successor to take his place instead of holding elections. And he had loyalist Nicolas Maduro took his place, who used to be a bus driver and a security guard, but rose up the ranks out of political loyalty. After Nicolas Maduro took office, Venezuela then begins going through a total economic collapse from 2014 onwards, and Maduro starts having the Venezuelan government become more repressive and authoritarian against protesters and dissent. Following more of this repressive behavior, the United States government starts villainizing the Venezuelan government more and trying to isolate and demonize Nicolas Maduro, to the point that we get to now. And during Donald Trump's first term in office, the United States pursued a regime change attempt to pressure Nicolas Maduro out of office. In 2018, the United States, under Trump, cut off all diplomatic relations with Venezuela and starting putting tough economic sanctions against Venezuela, including against their oil industry. And the United States tried to prop up an opposition figure named Juan Guaido in 2019 and tried to call him the new president of Venezuela. And that regime change ended up not working during the first Trump administration because Juan Guaido was not able to lead a successful revolt against the Venezuelan government and eventually ended up giving up and leaving Venezuela by 2023. So now in Trump's second term in office, it seems that he wants to try again to topple the Venezuelan government since his first attempts did not work during his first term, especially now with Secretary of State Marco Rubio, who is an ideological zealot, a very right-wing Cuban American who wants to see the end of both the communist government in Cuba and the socialist dictatorship in Venezuela, and for years has even advocated for an American military invasion against Venezuela. The Trump administration is trying to single out Venezuela, that they're the number one cause and exporter of drugs to the United States, and is doing drone strikes on boats and claiming that they are connected to Venezuelan gangs. The United States also has indicted Venezuela's dictator Nicolas Maduro since 2020 as a drug trafficker and has a $5 million reward for his capture and arrest. Donald Trump has authorized the CIA to do covert activity in Venezuela, and the U.S. could possibly be on the verge of possibly even invading Venezuela or trying to foment another regime change in the country. So what is it the United States really wants, and why is America so interested in regime change in Venezuela? Well, it has to go back to the United States wants to replace the socialist regime in Venezuela with an American-friendly government, because the United States, ever since Hugo Chavez took office, does not like a government there that is doing close business and relations with Russia and China and Iran. Venezuela has the largest oil reserves on the planet and also has lots of other resources such as gold and rare earth minerals. And currently Venezuela is doing business with China and Russia, and the United States wants access to that stuff. And so the US also doesn't want a government that's very vocally critical of American foreign policy. And the US wishes to replace that government with an American-friendly government.